Hey everyone, it's Matt. Thanks for joining me here in session 68 of Behavioral Observations podcast. Today's podcast is supported by an event that is hosted by Brett Denovi and Associates. This is a fun event at the Westin Hotel and Conference Center in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. It'll take place on November 30th, but it'll be live streamed and available well after that if you can't make it to South Jersey. So this event will feature a keynote by none other than Julie Vargas. Her talk is called Growing Up with B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist as a father. She'll be followed by talks from Brett Denovi and Matt Linder, both of Brett Denovi and Associates, and Dr. Dawn Hantula will provide the closing address. And all in all, this will count for 5.5 supervision CE hours. And best of all the proceeds from this event will go towards supporting the B.F. Skinner Foundation. So consider attending this great event where you'll learn lots of great information while contributing to a fantastic cause. And for more information about this event, you can go to the show notes to session 68. All right, on to today's episode. I am thrilled to be joined by Hannah Branigan from the Drinking from the Toilet podcast. Hannah is a dog trainer. And in fact, she's so good at it, she spends most of her time training people to train dogs. So we have a great expert on our hands here, and I really hope you'll enjoy this conversation and find it as informative as I did. To learn more about Hannah, you can head on over to her website, wonderpupstraining.com. And everything we talk about in today's episode will be linked up in the show notes for this one. You can go to behavioralobservations.com, session 68. And if you do check out her podcast, which I highly recommend you do, it would be great if you could leave a rating and review, which really helps us podcasters. So again, that's wonderpupstraining.com. The podcast is Drinking from the Toilet. And without any further ado, let's get right on to this fun conversation.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hannah Branigan, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
Oh, I am doing fantastic. I am so excited for this conversation. I am so in need of this conversation, more importantly. This has been a very popular topic when I threw this out to my listenership. And again, as we were chatting before we hit the record button, for folks who don't know, I generally email notifications of upcoming guests to my email list, which you can get on at behavioralobservations.com, and ask people for questions. Hey, I've got so-and-so coming on, and things like that. So, and I just got deluged with dog questions here. So this is definitely a topic that is relevant to my audience, and because we all know and love our pups, but sometimes it's hard for us, even those of us who have extensive training in behavior analysis, to really wrap our minds around. Okay, well, we can do that. We can make change with individuals that we work with, clients that we work with, but oftentimes we struggle at home. So we'll get a lot more into that in just a second. But again, I just want to welcome you to the show. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So I know you have this awesome podcast, Drinking from the Toilet, which is probably the best podcast title ever. It just makes me laugh every time I see it in my player. So I think that's super cool, especially from a branding standpoint, but just from a humor standpoint, more importantly. So I know you have this podcast. I know you have this practice that you have, Wonder Pups Academy, or Wonder Pups Training, right?
Yeah.
Thanks. So tell us a little bit about yourself. So tell us how you got into dog training, and specifically how you began to study and appreciate behavior analysis as, I guess, part of that process.
Sure. Well, it's in some ways it's a long story. In some ways it's a short story. But ultimately, I originally went to school in zoology, and then I went to graduate school for biomedical engineering. And I reached this point. I didn't have an amazing graduate school experience for a couple of different reasons. There was some turmoil in the department, and I was on a fellowship that required some things to happen in the department that I had no control over. So I think there are some aspects to everyone's graduate school experience where you have like all of the responsibility and none of the control. And you're trying to figure out how to live off of $19,000 a year. And
Sure.
at first, it seems like so much money, but then it turns out it's not. So anyways, when I was in undergrad, I was interested in like biotech stuff, and I was also interested in behavior. And the school that I was at for undergrad, NC State, at that time didn't really have much in the way of a behavior program. They had a lot more in biotech stuff. And my dad told me there's no money in behavior, so you should definitely go into biotech. And then when I got offered this fellowship my senior year, that seemed like a great way to not make a decision. You know, like you can just keep going to school for a little bit longer.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And not have to grow up yet. And so I did that. And after a couple of years, I realized that that I wasn't really enjoying it. And what that, to kind of operationalize that a little bit, what it took the form of was I had a dog that I had rescued. So I was volunteering in an animal shelter at that time. And I was training that dog because he had a lot of behavior challenges. He bit people, including me, barked at lunch and barked at other dogs, like just kind of the really stereotypical problem behavior dog. And so I was taking him to classes and I was enjoying training him, and I started volunteering at that facility to assist classes. And at the same time, I've completed the coursework for my graduate program, and I'm in the part where you're, all the research and writing. And I got to a point where I parked my car at the parking lot, I'd ride the bus in, and then I would stop at the lobby of the EPA building to throw up in the bathroom on my way up to the lab every morning, Mm-hmm. And the worse that got, the more time I was spending volunteering at the shelter and assisting in classes. And I realized after a while, what if I just flipped this? And I went with working with dogs full time and just said thank you and goodbye to this graduate school experience. And it was like a really kind of terrifying leap to take because, at that point there's a lot of that sort of sunk cost kind of fallacy feeling to it. I've got all this work already put into it, and all I have to do is just finish writing this dissertation and I'm fine. But I figured I didn't really want to, if it was this bad and I'm 23, it's probably not going to be any better at 33 and 43 and 53. So I decided to take a terminal master's, and I went into working with animals and their people full time, kind of just jumped.
So,
and yeah.
I've been all but dissertation for about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. So I totally get the unfinished chapter feeling. And that was the second graduate program I left. So
yeah.
I totally understand. It is a terrifying leap. When I did it my first time, I left. I was in a PhD program. I left with my master's degree, my first go around in grad school, and that's when I was working with dogs. My parents were like freaking out. They're like, "Oh my God, you're, blah 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 blah," and you can imagine fill in the blank. But fortunately, it worked out. It sounds like it worked out just fine for you. So talk about how you thought about working with dogs and training their owners and things like that. How did you discover the behavioral approaches that you're using currently to do this type of work?
So one, coming from a life science background, that was already kind of the lens that I tend to view the world to begin with. So I didn't know that. I didn't really know about applied behavior analysis at that time. The dog that I had, that I adopted as soon as I got my own apartment, that I could get well, technically pets weren't allowed, but I was able to have a pet in. And like I mentioned before, he had a lot of challenges, or he had a lot of problematic behaviors that I had to figure out how to deal with. And I was reading books to try and figure out how to help this dog. And of course I was also really young. So I felt like clearly I just have to figure out the right answer. I have to just love him enough, and I'll be able to solve all of these behavior problems. But I was working, found a trainer to work with, and in our very first meeting, I will not forget, he had helped me put a correction collar on my dog. And at that point, my dog had bitten another person and was lunging and barking at other dogs. And that was a problem, but he hadn't bitten me. And this other trainer gave me these instructions. He was going to bring his dog out of his truck and he was going to bring him around. And when my dog started to lunge and bark at his dog, I was to give a correction, yank the leash, and pop my dog on this pinch collar to teach him not to do the lunging and barking.
Are those the ones with the prongs in them?
Yes, yeah, okay, pinch collar, prong collar, yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to set in the rate, not because there's like the ones without those, but they do kind of choke the dog a little bit, right?
Yes, we have a lot of, much like with humans, we have a lot of ways to inflict punishment on dogs, but this one in particular was a pinch collar, which has it's like a chain link, but the links have prongs that all point to the center. So when you pull the leash, the whole collar constricts and it tightens and it presses the ends of the wire into the dog's neck. So I was desperate. I had to help my dog. And so I followed his instructions. He brought his dog out. My dog started to lunge and bark. I took the leash and gave a really nice hard pop with the leash, and my dog turned and bit me in the leg. And in that moment, it was like, you have those like out of body experiences where I had like the floating head looking down at me.
Sure.
And I remember thinking that the problem I had before, biting other people and barking at other dogs, that was bad. But at least he wasn't biting me. And this feels like even if we were to solve the lunging and barking at dogs problem, this doesn't feel like it's worth the trade-off to me.
Right, of course.
So I felt like I was now in a worse situation. So I didn't call that guy back again. And
what did he say, by the way? Like, was he like, oh, this is part of the process or something like that? Or was
pretty much. Yeah, it was, I just wasn't doing it right. I don't even really remember the rest of it. It kind of just, blurs into a haze. At that point, it wasn't a terrible bite. I do still have a little mark from it. I was wearing jeans, fortunately, but it was definitely like oh, that's interesting. And so I didn't call him back. And I went looking for other trainers, and I found another trainer in a different part of town who introduced me to the technique of clicker training. And that dog that I had, his name was Sammy. He was a hound mix, hound Rottie-ish something. He's black and brown with long ears and a really loud voice. And he was super easy to motivate with hot dogs. Way more than he could override a lot of physical discomfort in order to pursue whatever the reinforcers were involved in that behavior. But food, especially hot dogs and cheese, would totally like way higher on his hierarchy. So it's really, I kind of wish now that I would have clients that were that easy to fix in some ways. And I don't want to make it sound like it was easy, but once I stopped trying to focus on teaching him not to bark and not to bite, and brought food into the picture and started teaching those alternate behaviors and reinforcing those with food, he was really pretty quick to abandon a lot of the problem behaviors. And again, looking back, how could it possibly have taken that long to come upon that solution? But it just didn't know. And from there, it kind of took off. Once I had a few tools to help with the stuff, those behaviors that were really kind of on fire, for our lives together. And then I was like, okay, now what else could I do with this technology? And what else can I do with this technology? And now we can teach him to retrieve a beer from the fridge. And now I can teach him to, do all these other cool things. And I might even eventually competed with him in competitive obedience, which kind of opened a whole nother door for me in my world. So it was really pretty cool.
So you worked with one trainer, and I assume that you went on to acquire more knowledge from there. So what were some other sources of information that you were seeking, that you were learning, this basic, kind of behavior analytic formulation of how dog training works? How else did you pursue it?
I read a lot. I've always been a big reader. So once I had some terms to look up, I went and started reading a lot of books. I read Don't Shoot the Dog by Karen Pryor. Was a big influence early on. I'm trying to think what other books. Accelerated Learning with Pam Reed is another one that I read early on. Those are all really, really helpful for helping me understand how to, kind of frame what I was seeing in terms of behavior and reinforcement. And honestly, it was really piecemeal. I joined a Yahoo email list. That's how long ago this was. And mostly lurked for a long time, and then started asking questions. And I would read about different things people were trying, and I watched videos on YouTube. I attended seminars, and
I see. Were there any, especially these days, the YouTube channels and Facebook groups are pretty ubiquitous. Are there any ones that come to mind right now that you can think of that offer particularly good information? And if you don't have something off the top of your head, we can put something in the show notes later.
I can definitely off the top of my head, one of kind of the best YouTube channels that I'll often refer folks to is Kiko Pup, Emily Laurelum, who is a colleague and trainer. She does a great job putting together like some short tutorials, and it's all focused on using reinforcement and very progressive training methods. And she does good stuff.
Emily, that's Kiko Pup with Emily Laurel.
Yeah, Kiko Pup is the name of her channel. Kiko was one of her dogs, and her human name is Emily Laurelum, and I can send you a link for that.
Super.
She's got good stuff on there.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get CEs. And so let's keep, I guess, building this out a little bit, or tracing the arc to what you're doing these days. So you have Wonder Pups training, and you've got this podcast. So how do you typically, I want to get to the podcast in a second, but let's start with the Wonder Pups training. How do you typically work with clients now? Meaning, how do people seek out your services? Is it someone like myself who has an unruly dog, and they finally just get sick of it, and they're like, I got to do something, and then they Google and they find you and things like that? Or are people looking for to do agility or obedience, or is it all of the above? Kind of tell us how you work with us, owners.
Sure. Right now, my primary focus is I work mostly with other animal professionals. So other professional dog trainers or people who are competing in dog sports in some way. Obedience is really kind of my specialty. But I have a lot of students that work in kind of from a lot of different angles in that area. That's a relatively recent development, though. Between the graduate school thing and where I am now, I temporarily, while I was trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to be when I grew up, I took a job as a vet tech at a vet hospital while I was doing a little bit of training on the side. I was working as a vet tech because I needed something. You got to make up that $19,000 somewhere.
Sure.
And it turns out vet techs make just about $19,000 a year. So there's it's a pretty even trade, and you're still working, like 60 hours a week. So it's about the same thing as graduate school.
Oh yeah.
So I took a job doing that, and I was doing some training on the side, and the owners of that clinic had seen me working with my dogs, and knew I was kind of interested in this, and they asked if I would be interested in starting a training and behavior program at their clinic. So I started working mainly with their clientele. So, someone would come in with their dog and would either bring up a concern, or there would be an obvious concern in the lobby or in the exam room, and the vets would then refer that dog, that client to me, and I would help them come up with a plan to address the behavior. And I started teaching some group, just like basic obedience classes. And then also, because of my background, I started, and the fact that I was working in the context of a vet hospital, I was collecting a large practice of aggressive, reactive behavior clients. And I would teach some classes that were centered around that as well. And then what was really kind of interesting, the way I ended up in the competitive sports world and working with other trainers, is a lot of my clients followed the same kind of trajectory that I did. They came in with a dog that was lunging and barking. We got the lunging and barking under control. They got really kind of hooked on the training component. Turns out it's kind of fun. It's kind of reinforcing. What else can we do? And I would have to add, like, okay, well, we'll make a level 4 class now that you can come to, and we'll train tricks, and we'll train household behaviors, and then they do that. Now what else can we do? Well, I guess you could do a competitive rally and obedience or agility. And so then they would do that. And somehow I ended up with clients that started with dogs that had major behavior problems and were now starting to become athletes, which was really kind of interesting. And so I had, maybe 10 years of working mostly with basic pet dog stuff, walking on household manners, walking on a leash, greeting people politely, a large percentage of loud problem behaviors. And then that all kind of morphed into, now my current focus is really kind of upstream, in that I'm working with other people. Now I'm working with people who teach other people to train dogs.
Right. So it's more of a business to business play than
a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
Very nice. So how did the podcast come about?
The podcast came about because I don't like blogging. It was something that I kind of thought about. I've always been a podcast listener. I've listened to podcasts since I got my first iPhone, really. So a long time ago. I mean, this was a billion years ago now, right? I listened
some order of magnitude, right?
Yeah, I know, forever ago. I listen to audiobooks, but audiobooks are really expensive. Now, of course, I have Audible, but they're still kind of expensive. And then I discovered that you could listen to kind of like an audiobook substitute in the form of a podcast on your phone. So I got into listening to podcasts. And again, this was, I don't know, 10 years ago. How long have we had this stuff? Everything feels like 8 years ago to me. So we'll just go with 8 years ago.
Yeah, I got into the podcast game relatively late, at least as a listener. But so I'm not. But yeah, I know they've been around for a while. But certainly over the last 5 years or so, it's been quite a bit of an explosion of popularity.
Yeah, for sure. So I was listening to podcasts, and I was trying to blog and write articles for my business, and also because I discovered that particularly on the internet, your factual accurateness is not as important as your volume. And I think 2016 really kind of drove that home in a major way. Certainly for me, probably for a lot of us. And I was noticing that on some of these email lists and in Facebook groups, there would be people who would post very, they were writing a lot. They were very prolific, and they were very wrong. And I can waste a lot of energy arguing with people who are wrong on Facebook. And I was very shy about putting myself out there in a more official, more permanent way in the form of a blog. But I also felt compelled. I feel sort of a responsibility, a social responsibility to make sure that those voices aren't the only voices out there. That at the very least, there's someone else who's bringing a more progressive, evidence-based option.
So if I understand you correctly, what you were seeing out there, at least in the blogosphere and elsewhere, was perhaps some misinformation about how best to work with dogs, or at least is that
How best to work with dogs? How best to work with people? How best to work with that interface between people and dogs? Just old school, very, very punitive, very compulsive, and even some folks who are pretty good about focusing on reinforcement for working with the dogs can be very punitive towards people. Those skills don't always translate, and that
is sometimes often the case in behavior analysis as well. So
right,
or at least in what we do with behavior analysis.
Right. So it's in those, I feel like those voices don't help the cause. Like they're not making the world better because they're alienating people, even as they're trying to help the situation. We're driving away the people who are on the fence, who we could have educated and provided the skills and given the information. So I felt compelled to make sure that at least, rather than arguing with people whose minds I'm not going to change, can I make resources available to those people who are curious, who are interested in learning another way, without alienating them. And so I tried blogging, and I do still occasionally put articles up on my website in written format, but my perfectionism tends to be much more of a problem when I'm working in written form. And with a podcast, I can just hit record and kind of squinch up my eyes and talk real fast and then hit publish and run away a little more easily, because you can't really proof. Yes, I do a little bit of editing to clean it up, but I don't get sucked into the proofreading hole of, I'm sure there's a better way I could say this, that I do when I'm trying to write my thoughts down. So yeah. So that's kind of how I ended up with a podcast.
So I'd like to make just two quick observations. One is I would totally agree that blogging is ridiculously difficult. When I first started behavioral observations, I actually thought it was going to be a blog myself.
Yeah.
And it didn't take me too long to figure out, gosh, this is really hard. And you really, really have to research what you're saying, because there's all these other smart people who are going to look at this and be like, maybe not so much, And
who do I think I am to even try to write this? And don't I need a figure to illustrate this point? I don't know.
Yeah. And the second thing I'd like to mention is, when I first discovered, I've heard about your podcast because people mention it sometimes and some of the ABA Facebook groups. Someone will say, "Hey, what podcast do you listen to?" And animal training ones sometimes will come up, like, "Oh, I listened to this one and that one," and these are, and then there'll be like a subgroup of animal training ones, and yours is always at the top of the list. And I was going on a trip a few weeks ago, and I downloaded like a ton of them, and I was like, all right, let me just check some of these out. And one of the things that was really not surprising, but impressive to me was that a lot of your shows are solo shows, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think people really understand just how difficult that is to speak into a microphone with no other feedback. And so I just want to mention that, because it's really one of the most difficult things. Like what we're doing right now is having a conversation, right? And there's back and forth and things like that. But to speak for 20, 30 minutes uninterrupted on a particular topic in a way that's extemporaneous, and I, I don't want to get too kind of inside baseball in the podcasting world or anything, but I just want to basically make sure that the audience knows how difficult it is. Some of those shows that you're doing are to pull off, or at least I would find it. I know when I'll do like an intro segment to these, hour and a half long interviews that I do. And sometimes I spend so much time doing the intro because it's just me talking.
Right.
So I just want to give you some kudos there, because I know how challenging that is.
It is. Yeah, totally. It takes me longer to do the 20 minutes by myself than it does to do an hour-long interview, for sure. Yeah.
So well done. And so how long has the podcast been out? And I'm sure you've probably reached people all over the world, right? Tell us a little bit about some of the folks whose lives you've influenced.
It's been kind of crazy. So I'm coming up on 2 years. It'll be 2 years in February. I happened to launch it on Valentine's Day, not on purpose, but because I tend to get so kind of in my cave that I don't notice holidays happening around me. This is a consistent problem, but I happened to launch on Valentine's Day, but it makes it easy to remember. So this February, this Valentine or 2019 will be 2 years. And it has really been interesting, and it's brought me into contact with a lot of people. I've heard from, folks in Europe, India, Brazil. It's really interesting that those things I wasn't expecting. In fact, one of the ways that I help myself, like make myself do it, is I pretend nobody's paying attention, and that it's just like a private diary that I'm recording, because it's hard enough to read your own words that you've written, but listening to your own voice is like worse than like trying to record the outgoing message on your voicemail.
Oh, it's terrible.
It's really terrible. So one of the only ways that I can deal with my imposter complex there is I just pretend nobody's paying attention, but then nobody keeps emailing me, and they email me from all sorts of different countries and tell me like, oh my gosh, I heard your explanation of latency and it finally made sense. And I tried the suggestions that you made, and oh my gosh, the changes have been amazing. And then the responses that are really kind of keep me going, like that are the most reinforcing for me, are the ones where, they hear about some concept on the podcast and they try it with their dogs, and they're so amazed it works so well with their dogs, they turn on, they try it with their kids. And gosh, if it didn't work great with their kids too, so they tried it with their husband and they tried it with their employees at work. And that's really kind of why I do this is I do love dogs, and I really enjoy working with them. And I'm fascinated by that intersection between human behavior and animal behavior, and how we communicate with another species, and just everything in that like really kind of complex web. But it is when I hear about people who are taking the concepts and are running with them and applying them and extrapolating and figuring out how to use reinforcement more effectively with the people in their lives. That to me is like, that's where it's at. That's really why I'm here, because that is how we save the world, right? We're not just teaching dogs to walk nicely on a leash. We're changing the way people interact with all of the organisms in their environment, not just the ones on four legs.
Wow. One of my friends from graduate school, we were in the same lab together, and we worked with dogs quite a bit. She wanted to write a book called I'm going to mess it up. What was it called? How to Train Your Dog, Your Kids, and Your Husband, or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't think she ever realized the vision, but I just thought it was your story there kind of reminded me of what would be an epic book title, or a blog post or whatever. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, it sounds like it must be really gratifying to get that feedback from folks, especially on those kind of meta levels of generalizing these skills to different circumstances and I guess species for that matter. So
yeah, I mean the principles are the same. Behavior is behavior. So
for sure. All right, so we've been talking about a half hour or so, and we haven't even talked about how to control unruly dogs and things like that. I want to get into that in just a second, but
okay.
One other area I want to get into before that is I'm curious if you've worked with people like me, meaning someone who has a background in behavior analysis. I mean, maybe not necessarily a BCBA, but someone with a higher than average understanding of operating classical conditioning. Mm-hmm. And if so, are we more difficult students for you because we have this kind of curse of knowledge and so I'm curious if you've had encounters in the wild with folks of my ilk.
It's kind of funny. To my knowledge, I've never actually worked with anyone who, at least they didn't come out to me as a behavior analyst or use that.
We would lie too, by the way.
That language, yeah.
I've actually thought about that. If I ever hired a dog trainer, I would say I sold insurance or something like that. But.
Right. I work in IT. But I have quite a few veterinarian or vet type people who work in the vet industry as clients, and they do also tend to be very challenging. I've also had human psychologists and psychiatrists, and they also tend to be challenging. And it is something that I've pondered on, like, why is it harder to get you to be objective about this than with the average person who works at Cisco during the day, who actually works at Cisco during the day and isn't lying about it, and just wants me to help them, help their dog be more pleasant around the house. And And I don't have an easy answer. I mean, I kind of jokingly figured, much like how did I get interested in behaviors? Because I had a behavior problem to solve. And I figured probably there's some people who get into psychology because they have a psychological problem to solve. And so that probably bleeds over into their relationships with their animals and professionals that they hire as well. But it is, I do think that there is something to overcoming some preconceived kind of mental structures or constructs that is harder than starting from scratch, because you're having to unlearn a few things, and it's more obvious to me with vets because they have ideas of how things should be and what things should be like, and I think for all of us it is harder to be objective with inside your own life. You can't read the label from inside the jar kind of thing. I'm terrible about being objective with my own dogs, my own child, my own relationships. And so I do always have to ask for, I should always ask for an objective third opinion kind of to help me solve some problems. But I think it's especially, again, probably this would be less of a problem if we were really coming from a very clean kind of ABA perspective, but a human psychologist that's coming in with more of a language-based approach it's very hard. I can use the words like reinforcement and antecedent and they'll recognize them, but language only gets us so far when we're working with a nonverbal animal. And it can be really hard to get people to let go of some of those constructs.
I see. So what are some things are there species-specific things that people like myself are clueless about when we're conceptualizing these problems we're having with our dogs? Meaning, all these, very, sometimes we think of them in terms of dogs as their drive. Like I've got a mutt, and he is like a Rhodesian Ridgeback Boxer Vizsla mix, and so he is.
Wow.
Yeah, he barks a lot. He is very much hyper vigilant about everything. Mm-hmm. He sees a bird in the yard and he goes crazy. And so I'm thinking there's something. So what? I guess where I'm kind of rambling towards here is like, are there? I know you just finished saying it. Behavior, just behavior a few minutes ago. And but are there kind of biological underpinnings that we should be aware of as behavior analysts that we're not up to speed on?
For sure. I mean, there's obviously there's biological differences. I think probably the one that I run up against the most frequently that my own dogs like to remind me of, and I'll run into it with client dogs as well, is that dogs are predators. And they have all of that evolutionary, natural history of predatory biology and behavior. And that I think it certainly changes what's reinforcing, right? It changes what the reinforcers are. Very few of us enjoy chasing after a moving thing, grabbing it and tearing it to shreds. Well, small children, but after that, and then only if it's expensive. But those types of behaviors, which are they're very high frequency with dogs. They're very tied into that natural history element, chasing things, grabbing things, biting them, killing them, eviscerating them. It can be very alarming to us as humans, as we think of ourselves as fairly civilized. We don't think of food as coming from animals. It comes on a styrofoam tray with saran wrap, and to have a dog in front of you raid a nest of bunnies, or eat poop, or any of these kind of normal doggish behaviors feels I think it can be frightening, and it can certainly feel like a violation of that relationship that you have with your dog, and it can be a little trippy if you try to step out of your human mindset and put yourself behind the eyes of a dog. The bunny wasn't cute to the dog. The bunny was delicious, right? And it was not. The dog wasn't seeing the bunny the way that you see like a small innocent creature that needs to be cared for. He's seeing a prey item. So if we consider how the reinforcers play in there, and then those high frequency behaviors, it changes the way we look at the dog's behavior, changes the way how we reinforce the dog's behavior. I think that is a little bit different. Obviously, dogs don't speak, right? They don't have language, or I mean, they have communication, but it's not the same as the way that we can talk about things. Of course, people spend decades in therapy trying to figure out why they do and feel the way they do and feel things. So I really probably
language is not the end all.
Not yet, exactly. It's not a cure all for everything, but it is. That is something with my human learners. I can ask, "What does this look like to you?" Or, what happened right there, and they can at least give me some feedback. And with dogs, it's you have to observe, everything from the outside, which again is why I like looking at things in terms of the conditions and contingencies. What are the antecedents? Because I don't ever know what the dog is actually thinking.
Of course. All right. What about? Are there? I guess one question I had is: Are there a set number of responses or commands you think every dog owner should teach their pet?
No, and in fact, I have a little baggage around the word command. I really strongly prefer the word.
I know. I figured that was like I was struggling to. I was like, okay, I know this is going to come out wrong. It's like a behavior, a response to train.
There are kind of a few handy things that are really helpful. Although, more and more, the longer I do this, the more I think in terms of the human behaviors, because the dog's behavior is always going to follow the human's behavior. So if I need to change dog behavior, what I actually need to do is change the human behavior.
Of course, yeah.
For the dogs, specific cues, no, not really, because it depends so heavily on what your lifestyle is and what you need to enjoy your relationship with your dog. Some really kind of basic things that I like to make sure that we account for in some way is having some way to call the dog to you. So a recall like come can be really important. It doesn't matter what you call it. It can be a sound. It can be if your dog can hear. Not all dogs can hear. I work with some percentage of dogs that can't hear, so we have to find other solutions. But being able to recall the dog, so if they're away from you, you can call them to you. And of course, that ties back into dogs tend to, as predators, they tend to chase things. And when they are in chase mode or hunting mode, they're not paying attention to things like cars. So if your dog gets on the trail of a bunny or a deer, you want to be able to call the dog back, whether they're visually chasing it or chasing it with their noses, and being able to station the dog in some way on a mat or in a crate, but being able to have some concrete station place in space, like a dog bed that you can on cue send the dog to, and he can put his body there and hold that position for some amount of time, a few minutes. Those are really kind of the two main ones that I come back to when we have just in general, almost regardless of what the person is calling me for. The station behavior in general is really the perfect alternate behavior for so many of those annoying lifestyle problems that we run into, bothering you while you're trying to eat, jumping at people at the door, dashing out the door. If I have a behavior of go to your bed and sit, go to your bed and lay down and stay there until I give you another cue, and that has a really heavy reinforcement history, it tends to be very easy for people to teach. It's very fast for dogs to learn, and it gives me an instant substitute for the whole list of don'ts that people come with.
Right, because I think you've pointed out many times that dogs don't or something words to that effect, at least in some of the podcast episodes that I've listened to.
Yeah. Well, it's the dead man rule, right?
Yeah.
So people, we have all of the things that our kids or our dogs or our spouses are doing that are irritating, and I just want them to stop doing all these things. Well, we have to put something in its place, because that's not, don't steal food off the counter isn't a behavior, but wait on your mat while I cook dinner, that's a behavior. That's something that we can observe, we can reinforce it.
Awesome. So that's a great context to kind of jump into some questions. So as I mentioned at the outset, I got so many questions from listeners, over 24, which is quite a bit. And so time would not permit us to go through all of them. And a lot of them kind of fell into similar categories. So apologies to all of you who took the time to write in, that I won't be able to read your individual question. However, I'm hoping that these little categories that I created will be helpful for you. So let's talk about, one of the things that I'm sure you can't do is give very prescriptive advice, based without doing a thorough assessment and things like that. But I would like you to kind of maybe conceptualize how you might go about assessing and treating something like, some of these general issues, because I do these, and because these are just kind of like these composites of various other individual cases, if you will. So I'm going to run through a couple of things here and just kind of get your take on how you would deal with that. So I got a lot of questions on pulling on the leash. So
yes,
what is one way you would go about, remediating that?
So pulling on the leash or loose leash walking is as a behavior, or really it's a set of behaviors, is I consider it to be sort of like the holy grail of dog training. It's something that comes up in every dog training conversation. It's going to be your number one request as an instructor for clients. Clients coming in, they're 90% of them are they'll have another list, but they'll also have anti-pulls on leash. And it's a problem. One of the cultural things that we, or really it's kind of cultural assumption, is one of the things that you are supposed to do when you have a dog is take the dog for walks. You're supposed to take the dog for a walk. You're supposed to walk around the neighborhood. Maybe it's 1 mile, maybe it's 4 miles. It just kind of depends on your physical fitness, I think, to some extent. But we have this idea that if you have a dog and you are a dog owner, part of that identity is to take the dog for a walk. And in order to do that legally and safely, you need to have that seatbelt of a leash. And we end up with this conflict between human expectations and normal canine behavior, in that dogs don't really walk on leashes naturally. There's a lot of things that contribute to that. So, among other things, humans walk very slowly. They kind of walk like at the pace of death for a dog. Dogs would naturally travel more quickly unless you're like a mastiff, or big slow moving sometimes basset hounds. And so if you're walking slowly and your dog's walking fast and there's a leash tying you together, eventually the dog's going to hit the end of the leash. Probably not eventually, eventually is going to be a very short time in this case. And then, of course, if the function of the dog's behavior is to continue moving forward, and you continue walking with the dog while there's tension on the leash, well, you really create tension on the leash becomes part of that whole antecedent picture, and continuing to walk forward reinforces pulling on the leash. So you get this problematic contingency in play. And so the first thing that we have to do to solve the problem behaviors, we have to figure out how to stop reinforcing the pulling. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. You can certainly change equipment to make pulling less reinforcing. There are different kinds of harnesses and head collars. There's also collars that there's lots of different pieces of equipment that you could use that you can put on the dog that to varying degrees make pulling either harder to do or more uncomfortable. And so they're depending on a certain amount of behavior suppression through aversive stimulus to some degree. But so that's part of it. That's an option. That might be part of a solution. We also can stop, again, on the human behavior side, we can stop walking if the dog hits the end of the leash. And again, assuming the function of the behavior is continuing to go forward, we stop walking. At the very least, we're no longer reinforcing pulling. Those two things by themselves, though, usually don't do the trick. There's a whole lot of folks would really love to just put a no pull harness on the dog and change nothing about their behavior. And what that'll often do is you'll have a dog who for a couple of days or weeks is more pleasant to walk on leash, but before too long they get used to the harness, right? They develop that punishment callus, and the harness or the head collar, and this happens if it's a choke chain or a pinch collar, any of the equipment will eventually work less and less and less because they're continuing to be reinforced. They're still walking for it. So teaching, again, an alternate behavior, an easy alternate behavior in using food is the easiest way to manage this, in combination with paying attention to when we're walking forward? Is the leash loose when we're moving? And as soon as the leash is tight, do we stop walking? To either stop walking, you can back up. I usually just stop. Using food, I can teach the dog to stay in a bubble of space at my side. Just by creating a lot of reinforcement history there. Usually I like to start stationary. So I would have you reinforce your dog, maybe 20 times, just standing still, delivering food right at your hip. If it's a medium-sized dog. If you have like a Yorkie or a Chihuahua, we'll go down to your knee and you'll have to develop a good lunging kind of thigh strength. But for a medium dog, right at your hip. And if you keep delivering food there, the dog's going to tend to hang out there. And then we can take one step and deliver a treat at your hip, and take one step and deliver a treat at your hip. So you break down the walking forward one step at a time, continuing to build this massive reinforcement history right at your side. And then the leash isn't really part of the behavior. The leash is just, again, it's a seat belt. It's a backup plan. And we're really depending on that reinforcement history to keep the dog next to you and override the reinforcement for going out and investigating the environment. Once we have that built up and you can walk your dog for 10, 20 steps at a time, and they'll stay beside you in anticipation of that food reinforcement, then I like to substitute back into those kind of real life reinforcers. So the opportunity is sniff. So we'll plan it out so that you're walking up the sidewalk and you know that there is a bush that is a very popular bush in your neighborhood, and all the dogs enjoy that particular bush. And so if your dog can do 20 steps in your driveway or in your yard, for a food reinforcer, we'll start, maybe 10 steps away from this particular bush. The dog walks at your side for 10 steps. And while he's still in position and you've got a nice J or loop in the leash, you can say, hey, go sniff, and send the dog to go sniff the bush. The bush has all those interesting smells from all the other dogs in the neighborhood, very, very reinforcing. And from there, we can build that loose leash walking behavior for the opportunity to interact with the environment, and investigate and sniff and all the things that were originally maintaining the leash pulling behavior, but we're just swapping in a new behavior, having taught it with food.
So the reinforcement history is so strong, they're not running off to sniff that thing. So
yeah,
you have to get it that level of strength, if you will, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, you want to build a lot of mass on the behavior of being next to you. You have to generalize it to some extent, but it's from there. It's planning. If you think about it, you already know the places and the situations where your dog you're likely to see that pulling behavior. They're likely to blow you off and dive for a particular bush or a fence post or something. And if you plan it out, I'll use a food lure. So I might use, there's a particular bush up at the corner on my street that I know all of my, especially the boy dogs, but girl dogs too, like to investigate. And I will take a piece of hot dog, a piece of food, and have it on my dog's nose until I'm within range for the duration that I know my dog can maintain the desired behavior without a food lure. And I'll give him that treat, and then we'll start walking. And while he's still looking at me before, and this is the important part, before he hits the end of the leash, showing interest in the bush, because it has to be a reinforcer, right? So it has to come after the behavior. So while he's still at my side, engaged with me, he's oriented towards me, I can tell him, okay, or go sniff. And we can train that separately too, but often we don't have to, because it's such a high frequency behavior. You're just releasing the rubber band that you've already stretched. And if you turn and point to the bush, because of the way we live with dogs, they already have the behavioral response of following where we point, and you happen to be pointing at the best bush in the neighborhood. It's a really powerful reinforcer. And one of the things that I love about approaching it this way is it does not take very long if you're good with your timing, right? The timing has to be there. But once they start to put that together, you'll see the dog will notice something they'd like to investigate, an interesting trash can or fence post, and the dog will pause and look back at the handler with almost a request, kind of like, hey, are we going to go sniff that bush? And as soon as you start seeing that voluntary check-in behavior, you can say, yes, go sniff, and continue to reinforce it. And it maintains itself really nicely from there with some attention, with some mindfulness.
All right, very cool. Another common issue is jumping up on or barking at visitors, and we could probably throw aggression towards other dogs in there as well. If other dogs can, kind of come into the yard and things like that, I see that from time to time. With my dog, he's gets very excited when visitors come, jumps and barks and all that stuff. And depending on who the person is, sometimes he'll actually growl very aggressively, particularly towards men. And unfamiliar men. But even with my children's friends coming over, it's oftentimes quite embarrassing.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of big feelings tied up in how our dogs behave, which is interesting and complicated. That's
a podcast episode unto itself, I'm sure.
For sure, yeah, and just like dogs growling at your guests when they come over is right up there with your kid screaming and pitching a fit over a pair of sunglasses in Target. It's all very similar, a lot of overlap. So for this one, jumping up on visitors or barking at visitors, pulling towards another dog or barking at another dog, this is one where we really do have to do an analysis to determine what the function of that behavior is. We can have kind of, just for the purpose of discussion, I'll divide it into two main categories. So we may see this behavior as a result of wanting to interact. So they want to close the distance to the person or the dog. We may also see these types of behaviors, and the function may be to increase the distance. So they do not want to interact. So, we might call that defensive or offensive, or, it depends on how you want to label it. And I would treat them very differently depending on what the function of the behavior is. If it's a dog that, let's say it's Larry the Labrador, and everything about the world is a social opportunity, and social reinforcers are very high on his scale. And he really, really wants to greet people. And when he gets close to people, he just can't help himself. And he leaps up and licks their face and knocks them down because he's bigger than he thinks he is. And that's embarrassing in and of itself. It's also potentially dangerous, even though his intent is not to drive the people away or to cause harm, but just social awkwardness. So we have that category of dogs. And for these guys, my favorite approach to take is to use that opportunity to greet, but to slice it down really, really finely into small pieces, because they can often hold it together briefly. But if they stay in contact with the person, it just builds and builds and builds, and then they start exploding up and just, oh my gosh, lick, 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 jump, jump, jump. So I can put greeting the person on cue, very much the same way that we just talked about with loose leash walking. So you look up at me, go say hi, and give permission to go say hi, put that on cue. And then I can use that opportunity to go say hi to reinforce calmer looking behaviors, so that we are at the very least starting that interaction from a point of success, rather than a dog who's already squealing and spinning around. Because then if the dog's already squealing, then adding a person to that picture is not going to get better. It gets much worse usually. So we'll start from looking up at the owner, go say hi, and then because it tends to follow there's a sequence of behaviors there. They'll run in and sniff and then start to jump. What I love to do is, if the dog is easy to motivate with food, which most of this, I'm making a lot of generalizations here, which is really kind of dangerous, but for the purpose of conversation,
sure.
These guys tend to be pretty easy to motivate with, certainly Labradors. So as the dog is approaching the person to greet, I'll almost right before they make contact, I'll click and offer food back at my side. So they go out, get one sniff of the person, come right back for food reinforcement. And then I'll send them say hi again, and they go out, and I'll even make it a targeting exercise. So they'll touch their nose to the person's leg and come right back for a treat. And I'm changing the behavior that the dog does when they're greeting. So I'm interrupting that sequence of sniff the person, wiggle, jump up, put your feet on the person. And I'm interrupting it at the level of sniff. And then I can even exaggerate that sniff behavior into a nose target. The dog is nose targeting the person's leg. His feet are staying on the ground. And those approaching it that way and then building it that way, so now they're nose targeting it. The next step that I'll often do is have the dog turn sideways to accept petting, and so they're no longer front to front. They're not face to face with the person, but they're turning sideways, and that tends to be a little bit easier. And again, as soon as the person's hands are on the dog, click, come right back to the owner for the reinforcement. So we're really minimizing the time of exposure to this really intense situation, and they come back for food reinforcement, and then we go back, and building it up like that tends to prevent that sequence of too excited behavior that results in the problems like putting your feet on people and putting your mouth on people and licking their face, which not everybody likes.
Of course, yeah.
And we can build it that way. So building duration of feet on the ground from the approach and then working forwards. For the other category of dogs, of course, that wouldn't work, because if the function of the behavior is to drive the person away, then an opportunity to greet would not be reinforcing. That would be counterproductive, and it would potentially dangerous. As much as being knocked down by a 70, 80-pound Labrador is a problem, being bitten by an 80-pound German Shepherd is even more painful.
Yep.
I've done both, and I can say for sure I don't like either one, but the biting is more problematic. So we definitely want to avoid that. And we can really almost use the same kind of approach, but with the opposite reinforcers. So if you pick an alternate behavior, relax on a mat can be one, look up at the handler can be one. And instead of reinforcing that with the opportunity to greet, we can send the other person away. So, here comes an unfamiliar person approaching. The original behavior, barking, the function of that behavior is to drive the other person away. We want increased distance. I can substitute, look up at the owner. The dog looks up at the owner, and then the unfamiliar person backs off. And so the same reinforcer is now maintaining a better behavior, look up at the owner. And that can work really, really well because it addresses the function. That does require formal setups because the other person has to be in on the game, and you have to have a way to communicate that.
Right. So I've got two questions related to that. One is, have you seen dogs that exhibit one of those functions with some people and then others with other, meaning, because I'm just trying to, of course,
totally.
this is all about my dog, honestly.
Yeah.
This is not about the listener's dog. Sorry, guys. Yeah. This is just one-to-one therapy for moi. No, kidding. Not, but for people that he's familiar with, he'll do that lab thing, and then for unfamiliar, particularly, big dudes and stuff like that, it's the ridge on his back goes straight up, and
dinosaur mode.
Oh yeah. He doesn't bite, but boy, does he scare the crap out of people, because he gets right up them and he's snarling and things like that. And if people stay still, he realizes, okay, I'm thinking he's, categorizing it as, okay, not a threat. I've now gone through this process, and you're not a threat, and you're okay, and he's fine. So I've got a question. So if you've seen the same function given with or different, exhibiting either one of those in the same dog, and then secondly to that, talk about your functional assessment strategy more generally. Maybe we'll start with that one. How do you go about figuring this all out? I mean, is it just observation and interview, data collection, a little bit of.
Yeah, it depends, right? So for particularly if there's a bite history involved, I will prefer to collect most of it through an interview, because I don't need to be bitten to analyze the function of that behavior, and I prefer not to, especially as someone who's self-employed and I buy my own health insurance. So
it makes all the sense in the world to me.
So safety first. So most of the time we'll start with an interview. And it is actually very common to have the same dog exhibit similar behaviors under similar conditions with different functions. But when we start to dig a little deeper, there are almost always, you hesitate to say always or never when it comes to behavior, but most of the time, there are differences in the topography and the appearance of the behavior, the movements, the body language, the behaviors that we see with a dog that is interested in greeting and a dog that is interested in biting tend to be a little bit different, even though we might use a label like barking for both.
Okay.
Or lunging for both. But if you look at the way they're holding their ears, the way they're holding their mouth, there will be differences.
Okay, so there's separate response classes possibly.
Usually,
with
separate.
Accessing different reinforcers.
Yeah, and then there are often also subtle differences in the condition. So a common example would be a dog that, in fact, I have a dog in my house like this, who is, if you were to be in a crowd of people, if we were to get to the park and there were just other people hanging out at the park, no problem. However, if you appear suddenly in an otherwise empty space, like if you were to open a door and walk in to a room that we were in, or if you were to appear on the horizon as the only person, there will be a difference in response. That sudden environmental contrast between nobody there and suddenly there's a person there tends to be a factor. And then if you also add in, and you're a dude, and you're unfamiliar, and you're wearing a backpack, and you've got sunglasses on, those different factors will contribute to what version of the behavior that we see. So I have my youngest dog, who's a border collie. He's a herding dog, and he notices everything, absolutely everything, and he is very vocal. He has a lot of vocal behaviors, a wide range of vocal behaviors, some of which are growly and scary, and some of which are barky, and some of which are high pitched and irritating. A lot of them. But if we were to walk into your house and you were already there, he would probably either ignore you or sideways wiggle, wag his tail, greet you, and then go on about his business. But if he was in my living room and you opened the front door and walked in, you'd get a very close up of all of his teeth, right? He'd be lots of barking, very forward hair, piloerection effects, very different. And the difference there in the conditions would be, you were already there in one situation, he walked in, versus you walked in the other situation. So identifying those specific differences between conditions is a big part of what we try to figure out. And then is there a way that we can either just manage it, like just prevent access, like just don't let that happen. Put the dog in a crate when people come over is a really quick and easy solution. Most of the time, that's what we're going for with most pet dogs. Dogs don't need to greet people at the door. Especially if they don't want people coming over to their house, there's nothing to be gained from quality of life for them being at the front door when grandma comes over. So in those cases, let's put Brownie in a crate in the back bedroom with a nice chewy or a stuffed Kong to work on, or a food toy. He's getting lots of enrichment. He feels safe, he's secure, and he does not need to interact with someone that he is clearly threatened by, such that we're seeing these problematic behaviors. So often management, often just preventing it if it's not something that they need to interact with. And again, that's where human expectation management is a big part of it. If your expectation is that your dog should be loose in your house at all times, even when the plumber comes over, and you feel like that in order to be a real dog owner, your dog has to be able to do that, then I either, as a trainer, have to figure out how am I going to modify this dog's behavior to bridge this gap, or I need to talk to you about what's a realistic expectation and what do you actually need to feel safe, to feel good about having your dog as part of your life.
I see. Yeah, I would. We definitely. Excuse me. We definitely crate our dog when we have people coming over working on the house and things like that. So I'd be in that category. Cool. Thanks for stepping through that. I know this is kind of, it's all in the abstract with these imaginary dogs, but. All right, let's talk about. I got some questions about puppies nipping at children. Mm-hmm. So, what has been your experience working with dogs who exhibit these behaviors?
Sure. So, this is a super common one. My favorite part about getting a call that a puppy is mouthing or nipping at a person, especially a child, is that the good news is if you do nothing, it goes away. It's almost always developmental, and as they learn other behaviors around the house and just grow up and get grown up teeth, the behavior itself will go away. So it's it's very low pressure. It doesn't mean it's not irritating and frustrating to deal with for the 4 months or so that it is an issue. Again, mostly I just manage it. Children puppies have a lot in common in that they're both still very much learning. They tend to be loud. They excite very easily. They run around a lot. They're excited by movement. So they tend to feed each other a lot. So a couple of quick tips. One, creating the puppy during those times of day when you know the kids are more likely to be more active. So I put my youngest dog, who's still very much a puppy, is bordering on adolescence, which is worse in some ways. I tend to put him away. I'll put him in another room, in an X pen or a crate with something to chew on in that late afternoon time period when my daughter is most insane. And so they don't share the same space. And then when the puppy, so kind of this ties back to your question about what are some of the biological differences. Dogs are generally considered to be crepuscular. So they're most active around dawn and dusk in general. And so I know that he's going to have high energy periods where he's moving around a lot and he's looking for something to put in his mouth. And when we first get up and towards the evening. So I make sure they're just not in the same space when they're having their high energy time periods. If they are together, I make sure the puppy has something to put in his mouth. So if my daughter, who is 5, wants to pet the puppy, I will give her like a big stuffed toy that she hands him, and then he is holding that and having that in his mouth while she's talking to him and interacting with him. I mean, her natural voice is high pitched and squeaky, so she sounds like a flying squirrel when she's talking just because she's little, and that's very exciting, very prey sounding. And when she runs around and flaps her arms, it's very exciting. So giving him something else to do with that most relevant part of his body during that interaction goes a long way. But it most of it is just they don't. Again, it's human expectations. We have this Disney idea of the children and the puppy playing together in the backyard, and that's just not how it usually plays out. So managing them during the 4 or 5 months, usually not much, doesn't go much further than that, so that the puppy is learning how to be a dog, and it also lets some of the newness, some of the novelty wear off on the kid's side as well. The dog is really part of the furniture, and from the dog side, the children are part of the furniture. And by the time the dog's a year old, it's usually really not that much of an issue.
So it sounds like it's an opportunity for a quick win.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. As long as the hardest part really is letting go of the adult human reinforcement of that image of my dog and child or their Christmas card playing together in the backyard, and I can be inside cooking dinner or scrolling Instagram on my phone or something and ignore it and not have to be involved, which I think a lot of people kind of want to get a puppy for the kids and hope that the puppy will entertain the kids. And instead they have one more child whose behavior they have to manage. And that can be overwhelming to a lot of families.
For sure. So speaking of overwhelming and having to manage stuff, we got a lot of questions about dogs leaving the yard. I got questions with, having everything to do with, should I put up a fence? Should I do an electric fence? The dog historically stayed around the house, but now is, kind of wandering off, and things like that. Do you have a general rule of thumb as it relates to, dogs being unleashed in spaces that aren't contained? What's your thinking on that?
It depends.
Of course.
Yeah. So I would say in general, I strongly prefer a physical barrier over an imaginary one. We can and do all the time do positive barrier training with dogs. And I actually have a video I can give you a link to on my YouTube channel where I taught my dogs before my daughter was born, and then we reviewed it shortly after she was born, to teach them to stop at the threshold to her room upstairs. And I needed to be able to do that without a baby gate, because if I'm carrying a lot of things, I can't open and close. I mean, I could, but I did not want to open and close the baby gate. So I just taught them a threshold behavior there. So if I walk across the barrier, they stop and wait on the other side. And we can do the same thing with a yard space. Same principles apply, and it's effectively the same ideas with an invisible fence. With the invisible fence is a brand of a radio fence collar. So there's a buried wire usually. There can also be an RF transmitter. The wire is slightly more reliable than the RF transmitter in the consistency of the field. With an invisible fence, the dog wears a receiver collar that has an electric shock element on it. And so as they approach the signal that the wire is giving off, or if they're leaving the field or they're approaching, if there's a couple of different ways that they can work, but it responds to this radio frequency signal and usually gives a warning beep, 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 beep. And then if the dog continues to approach or doesn't back away, there's an electric shock. So they get a conditioned punisher followed by an aversive stimulus. And the idea is that they'll learn to, when they hear the beep, move back out of the zone where the beep happens in order to avoid the shock. So that's a very punishment-based way to keep the dog in the yard. We can have basically the same effect by using a conditioned reinforcer as the dog approaches the boundary and then providing reinforcement inside the zone, right? So if in the example of the doorways are super easy, that dogs pick up on that very quickly. It's easy to maintain criteria. Timing's very easy there. It's a little bit harder with a larger boundary just because of the space involved. But as the dog approaches the boundary, you click and you throw food away from the boundary, the direction you want the dog to go. The dogs they collect those clicks along that boundary. And as they approach it, oh, where's my food? And they turn in anticipation of the reinforcement. Same basic effect as a dog approaching the boundary and turning in anticipation of avoiding, or some negative reinforcement, avoiding the shock or the beep. So same kind of thing. And we can even play this out there are remote food dispensers like a pet tutor or treat and train. What I've often done with clients is set up a pet tutor on like their deck. And then they can sit on their deck, and as the dog approaches a flagged boundary around their yard, they mark with the remote or the pet tutor, which makes a beep, and the dog comes flying back to the porch to eat the treat that comes out of the dispenser there. So that's something that once we set it up, they can maintain it from you inside the house using. These days, technology is so crazy. You can remotely reinforce your dog with a dispenser from an app on your phone, which is just crazy.
Oh my gosh.
So, I know it's really crazy. It works really, really well. And honestly, I would love to see some actual data here in terms of to compare the two. But just anecdotally with my clients, the positively reinforced boundary works just as well as the negatively reinforced one, and without a lot of the trade-offs. So the one of the bigger problems, and I get a lot of calls for this. In fact, ironically, my own parents, who I do not work with. My parents, I refer. I always recommend referring friends and family for emotional health.
For sure.
Yeah. So with the invisible
we
fence,
call that in ABA dual relationships.
Yes. Yes.
Where it gets into that neck of the woods at least.
Yeah. So with with any of these imaginary fences we're just depending on a reinforcement history and there's no physical barrier there. One of the drawbacks is it may help increase the frequency of the dog staying inside the boundary. It does nothing to affect the behavior of other dogs, people, animals, joggers, deliverymen. It doesn't do anything to keep them out, and they can't see the barrier there. So for a dog that already displays maybe barking or behaviors we might associate with fear or aggression when unfamiliar people arrive. If you take maybe a dog like yours who just right now growls and barks and maybe lunges forward at the person but has never made contact or bitten, and you have a meter reader or utility person is walking into your yard
or UPS delivery. They're walking and they step over this invisible fence wire, not knowing that it's there. Your dog comes flying out from behind the garage, notices there is now an invader. Aliens are actually attacking. They're coming for your stuff. The world is coming to an end.
The world's coming in. He starts growling and barking. The guy is crossing the boundary in these new escalated conditions. He doesn't hear the beep, or he goes more quickly towards the barrier than the beep registers. And as he reaches the UPS guy, he gets a shock. And so now we've paired the appearance of an unfamiliar person in your yard with a very terrifying aversive stimulus. It's a really fast way to escalate a growling and barking dog to one who's biting. And so it is very common to have dogs that will bite at the driveway or will bite at the yard when a jogger comes in through this kind of learning history. And so for spaces where the yard is narrow or there's high traffic, if you live in a neighborhood like on a cul-de-sac where there's a lot of joggers are going back and forth past your dog who's in the yard, that 5-foot setback is not enough to rely on for that behavior. So I don't recommend the shock-based invisible fences at all for any dog. However, there are certainly situations where you could get away with it with very little fallout, and there are situations where it's very high risk. So small yards, high foot traffic or high traffic spaces, or people coming and going. If you have like 4 teenage sons who have friends over all the time, these are usually situations that the risks outweigh the benefits of that invisible fence. And so they're putting up a physical fence or using a yard or using a leash is going to be a lot more effective. Other things to keep in mind, particularly with the shock-based ones, that radio frequency, the RF field that the caller is using to decide when to shock your dog is variable. It's not the same all the time. So if you turn on the microwave or if you move metal lawn furniture, it will actually change the shape of that field. And so now you have a dog who is being shocked in his mind randomly. And again, the fallout, the more random that punisher is, the more weird behavior problems you'll see develop. And that's actually really common.
Really?
The way. Yeah, people don't. It's the physics problem, right? Like, and who gets a dog thinking they need to be able to do calculus physics to figure out where this field is actually pulling? So, like, if you,
so the hardwire ones don't have this problem.
No, the hardwire, all of them do. The ones
okay.
that,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the ones that have the ones that function with like a base station that send out a signal, those tend to be the least reliable because, again, your dog can be hanging out in the kitchen and you turn on the microwave and that current will cause the shape of the field to change, and all of a sudden your dog gets shocked when you turn the microwave on. And that's really, like, if you're in your house and you can randomly be zapped, that can create some weird superstitious behaviors.
That is the opposite of well-being for sure.
Right, exactly. And then with the outside ones, again, the field tends to be narrower to begin with because they set it up to be 5 to 7 feet on either side of the wire. But if you live in a neighborhood on 1/10 of an acre and your whole yard is only 20 feet across, and you have a big metal HVAC unit to one side of your house, and you run current through that, it's going to change the way the shape of the field. A large metal object will tend to pull the field towards it. So if you set a big metal table and set of chairs on your patio to one side of that wire, it'll tend to pull the field, and all of a sudden you push your chair back and your dog who is laying on the patio gets shocked.
Wow, I never thought of that. That's crazy.
It's weird. It is really, really weird. And so again, if you have 4 acres and you're out in the country and you're able to run that wire 100 feet away from any other source of metal or electricity, it's probably not going to change that much. And you'll probably not see a big change in behavior other than your dog doesn't run away and is less likely to chase deer. Of course, if you're in that situation, you may have coyotes that are coming into your yard and they may attack your dog. So you have to take all of the factors into consideration and how you want to live with your dog and what your expectations are.
I see. All right. Let's see. Eating inedible objects. I had some people write in asking about their dogs who are eating socks. One listener wrote in asking for a friend, of course, saying something about the dog eating underwear and having it come out the other end, and I mean just all sorts of nasty stuff like that. So
So whenever pica comes up, my first recommendation is we need a good rule out of medical problems from a veterinarian. A lot of the times there's an inflammatory process that's going on that is involved, and until we address that medically, we're not going to have a lot of success with the behavior. And this can be a serious medical problem. Dogs have multiple surgeries to remove foreign objects that they've swallowed. I understand this can also be a problem with people in some populations as well.
Oh, absolutely, yes. We in our field work, we come across that quite a bit.
Yeah. So it is very interesting. It is actually very, very common to have the primary symptom that people show up with is that the dog is eating dirt or eating leaves or eating socks or something. And you go in with an ultrasound and gosh, they've got some horrible inflammatory bowel thing going on. And so you get them on a food trial or steroids or whatever. This is not my area of expertise. This is where I refer. And the pica improves. And I had a dog that was very similar. She would eat dirt when she was having a relapse, and she had to take a lot of medication, and she turned out to live a perfectly decent length and quality of life with the appropriate treatment. And one of the ways that I could tell that we needed to adjust her meds was she would start eating dirt again. However, we can also see we can see the behavior in an otherwise healthy dog. It's often Labradors and Golden Retrievers, not always, but and it does tend to be limited to young dogs. That often improves as they get older. So management, which is not like on my side, it's just management. That's an easy thing to say. Just stop leaving your socks on the floor. However, I also know that human behavior is often more challenging to modify. And
yes, out of all the 5 people in our household, I think I'm the only one who picks up his socks. So yeah.
Right. So yeah. So on the one hand, if you have a 6-month-old Labrador that's stealing underwear and taking them out into the yard and either eating them or destroying them or just leaving them in the front yard for the neighbors to see, the first solution is stop leaving your underwear around. But failing that, or if that's enough, or it becomes more serious, then again we need to do analysis. What are the conditions where this is happening? And sometimes it's a response. There's some antecedent that's occurring. There's the UPS guy. Some disturbance outside the house, and the dog runs around and starts looking for something to put in his mouth. So then, we need an alternate behavior when the UPS truck pulls up. So can I have the dog go to a food dispenser at the back of the house? Sometimes it can take almost a attention-seeking function. The dog will steal laundry while you're on a conference call, and that causes you to have to put the phone down and chase the dog around to get your underwear back. Very effective at getting attention, and very predictably occurs just like child behavior on the cue of your picking up the phone, you're talking on the phone.
Oh, yeah, it's a kid magnet for sure.
Exactly. So again, in those, I know I'm going to be on a conference call. I'm going to give my dog, I'm going to confine the dog. I'm going to give him a stuffed Kong or a food toy to work on, to replace that behavior.
So right now I'm just, as we're doing this interview, I'm praying we don't get like a phone call or a UPS delivery or, again, the company coming to read the meter and et cetera. So I get it.
Yep. With some cases, we'll end up actually going. It's management. It's prevention. We'll train the dog with good training, with good training practices, good conditioning to wear a basket muzzle so they can't put things in their mouth. I don't love that as a long-term strategy. Some people do. I just find compliance is low with the average client, remembering to put the basket muzzle on all the time and having to do that. They'll do it for a couple of weeks and then they'll get tired of it, or even a couple of months, and then they'll nothing bad has happened in a while and they'll leave the muzzle off. This is also true for aggression. And then as soon as the muzzle's off, the behavior of course comes back and the dog swallows the rock and they're back in surgery again, having the rock removed. So again, looking for other ways to, can we identify some change in the environment that is triggering this behavior to occur? And can I change that, or can I teach an alternate behavior in that space? Is usually where I like to put my attention. But and that's after we've made absolutely sure that we've ruled out anything in medical with a veterinarian.
Got it. It's very practical, good advice. I've probably kept you way over the time we've allowed. Do you have time for another category?
Yeah.
Well,
it's good. We get one more.
All right, cool. So I got a bunch of questions about sound hypersensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the flip side of that, I got some questions about working with deaf dogs. You mentioned that earlier. How do you signal to deaf dogs if they're, if a clicker is not going to work or something like that?
We have a couple of options. To sort of to take the place of the clicker, we'll usually use either a hand signal. So a popular one is a thumbs up, or my friend who wrote a book about deaf dogs, she uses she starts with her fingers all pulled in, like almost in like a fist, and then extends her fingers out quickly and then back to the fist. So you get that same kind of quick on off effect. Same thing if you're flashing a thumbs up. All of those can work really, really well.
What's the name of the book?
I want to say, I don't know. Let's see. It's like Living with Your Deaf Dog.
Okay.
I can look it up. If you hadn't asked me, I could have told you. As soon as I mentioned, I knew you were going to ask me.
Well, I'll give your friend, a little, little publicity, and at the same time help the listeners out if they're working with a deaf dog. And so
it's a common problem. Yeah,
we'll find that and put it in the show notes for today's episode. So
yeah,
all right, so hand signal.
A hand signal, or we'll also use like a little LED like keychain light that you can flash against visual stimulus. Just like a clicker, works quite well. All of those only work, of course, if the dog is facing you, which is the big challenge with deaf dogs. If they're not looking at you, they no longer aware that you exist.
So do you train up that attending?
You have to train a lot of default check-in behavior, reinforce the heck out of that in all contexts. And then the other tool that is helpful, again, technology to the rescue, is you can get a vibrating collar. So that works similarly to a remote shock collar, but without the shock feature. It just has a little vibrating motor. So if you tap a button, it just still takes some conditioning, right? Because just being vibrated at suddenly could be alarming. However, I'll carry around, I'm trying to think how to say that without sounding dirty, but it's a small machine that vibrates. And it's, anyway, never mind. I'm lost on that one. But anyways, you can condition you can condition it to be a condition reinforcer. So when they feel the vibration, they seek out the owner for reinforcement. And that can be, that combination of things usually works pretty well. For sound hypersensitivity, again, it depends on what's going on. It depends on the sound. There are certainly individuals who have a lot of different sounds that, like there's they hit they threshold very quickly. That there are even more dogs that have like a specific category of sounds they respond to. Fireworks, thunder would be the biggest, most common complaints that we'll get. For those things, we'll usually combine basic counter conditioning, desensitization if possible. Easier with fireworks because you can plan for that. Harder with thunderstorms, depending on what part of the country you live in. And one of the bigger challenges particularly with thunderstorms, and to some degree fireworks, is again that lack of control. And there sometimes management with medication is a really useful tool that can really help, especially since the response to those particular categories of sounds, the thunderstorms and fireworks in particular, behaviorally can reach such extreme intensity that it can become life-threatening. Dogs go through windows. They claw through drywall. And so if we have a dog that's clawing through drywall, but it's only an issue, 2-3 days out of the year, it's often not really worth training. Let's
get him a benzo.
Yeah, let's get some good meds on board and let him sleep through July 4th. And then we'll wake up and we'll live our lives from there. In the South, where we have summer thunderstorms kind of intermittently, and they can be very unpredictable. They can occur at 3:00 in the afternoon or 7:00 at night, and you don't always know. Again, that's where working with a vet and having medication handy, because there's not a lot we can do about the thunderstorm that happens while you're at work, and it can be really traumatic for the dog. So working with a qualified veterinarian so that we can keep the dog safe is really, really helpful. And then in the wintertime, we can get some thunderstorm recordings, and we can work on some alternate behaviors and do some desensitizations when you're not, because of course it doesn't do any good. You can be 3 days into your desensitization protocol, and all of a sudden a thunderstorm blows up while in the middle of the afternoon while you're at work, and you can't be there, and everything's undone.
Of course. You've mentioned clicker training quite a bit. Mm-hmm. What is a good way to get started with it? I actually own a clicker. I've kind of played around with it for a little bit, and then guess what? I think it's in my junk drawer in my kitchen. And again, I am laying myself bare for this is like confessional, behavior analyst confessional. It's I think it's one of those things. I think you had a podcast about this, if I'm not mistaken, about like how to find time to train your dog. You know, and
cobbler's children. Yes.
And so it's just one of those things. You do this. Kind of you attend to these things all at the. You don't want to do your work at home or I don't know. So anyway. I'm making excuses, but so let's say I'm now sufficiently psyched about this. I'm talking to a real life professional here, and I'm making the decision to commit to kind of getting my act together as it relates to developing a better relationship with my dog. Mm-hmm. And I want to start using the clicker. What's a good way to kind of get going with that? So assuming I find it amongst like the 9-volt batteries and all the other crap that's in there in the kitchen junk drawer.
So the first thing I have to mention, of course, is that it isn't about the clicker, right? The principles of using this event marker, you don't have to have the clicker. So even if you can't find it, it's fine. In fact, for some dogs that are very, like, say, hypersensitive to noise, we occasionally, like 1 in 1,000, I'll have a dog that is afraid of the sound of the clicker. So, of course, if the dog's afraid of the sound of what I want to use as a conditioned reinforcer, that does not help me. That's not productive. I need something else. So you can still use some other kind of acoustic marker. So we'll often use like a pen.
Okay. Cool.
So you can just click a ballpoint pen. Same effect, right? You don't have to go to the pet store or buy anything or anything online for that. You associate it with usually food reinforcement. That's the simplest. What I usually have folks do to start off with is, we know that your dog has to eat. And there are lines. There are some ethical lines in terms of how long you're comfortable depriving your dog of food in order to make a training goal. I don't really feel comfortable depriving my dog a whole lot, but I will totally use the calories that they were going to eat anyway to reinforce behaviors that I like. So the advice I usually give to new students is, we'll measure out however much food that dog would normally eat during the day. So let's say you have a 60-pound dog and he eats 3 cups of dry dog food a day, and that maintains a healthy weight. We'll throw that 6 cups of food into a Ziploc bag. Maybe add a couple pieces of something more interesting, maybe, a few pieces of turkey or something like that, into that bag. And then starting first thing in the morning, we use that bag to reinforce anything that the dog does that you like. So, coming in from outside after you let him out to go potty in the morning, you snap a leash on, give him a handful of food. You can throw that Ziploc bag in your pocket or use a treat pouch and use it throughout the day, with or without the clicker, but mark and reinforce the behaviors that you like. And then at the end of the day, if there's any food left in the bag, they get that in, it could be in a bowl, but I usually prefer to have it in some kind of enrichment activity. So in a food dispensing toy, or you can even just scatter it in the yard and let your dog forage like the opportunistic scavenger he's meant to be. And that, just making that one change will often help a lot. The goal for my clients is they are supposed to use up that bag of food throughout the day. So looking for things to reinforce throughout the course of the day until they run out of food. That rarely happens because it's very hard for us to find that many good things in one whole day, unless you have a teacup Chihuahua and he eats like a tablespoon of food. Then it's really easy.
I was gonna think I should buy some larger chunk kibble because
yeah. So that's the first recommendation that I make. And again, that really goes a long way, because you'll usually identify 3 or 4 points in your day where your dog is doing something you really wish they wouldn't, and you'll find something. Even if I didn't give you any more instruction, you'd find some way to reinforce with a little bit of background. Adding to that, I love that station training or go to mat type of behavior as a gateway behavior for clicker training. And again, because it functions as such a beautiful alternate behavior for everything irritating that your dog does that might make you feel frustrated. So we'll set the dog's bed up. And my favorite way is I want to, because I'm trying to modify the human's behavior, I need to account for cues that are occurring in the human's day to create the behavior or induce the behavior in the human that I want to then affect the dog's behavior. So, for example, in the evenings, my favorite way to decompress is to watch something on HGTV like House Hunters and criticize the home buyers. And while I'm doing that, I don't like being breathed on or drooled on. So I'll tend to be irritable. And because I've been positive all day, I've been reinforcing everyone in my life all day long, and I just kind of, the well is dry. So I need 30, 45 minutes to myself. So during that time, I really want my dogs to lay on their beds and not breathe on me. So when I have a new dog in my house, so I have a new puppy, I'll set up his mat, and I'll sometimes use like an actual dog bed or cot, but more often I just use it like a bath mat. Really inexpensive. I buy them at Home Goods or Costco. And I'll sit on my sofa where I normally sit, put my glass of wine on the coffee table, and the mat goes right next to my seat on the couch, except for it's on the floor. And I have his dinner, the puppy's dinner, in a bowl right there. I've already measured it. I know how much I need him. I want him to make sure that he gets enough to eat, but he's going to get it while being on the mat. And so I'll just sit there with my wine, watching HGTV and reinforcing him just for being on the mat. And because I happen to have a bowl of food and there's a mat between me and him, and the coffee table and the sofa makes up the other walls of that space, he can't help but be on the mat. So he gets a lot of reinforcement just on the mat, eating food off of this bath mat. And then after 2 nights of that, I'll slide the mat a little bit further away from the couch. Now I'm tossing it, maybe a foot or two. And the next night I move it a little bit further until eventually he's laying on a dog bed that's against the wall while I sit on my couch, sip wine, and watch House Hunters, and I can throw food to him. And then with my older dogs, I don't need to throw the food during the House Hunters because they've been doing this for 7 years, 10 years, 13 years. At the end of House Hunters, the closing music has become a conditioned reinforcer or a cue to run into the kitchen to eat their dinner from their bowl. So it creates a routine that's really easy to reinforce, but it's a really nice one to work into your routine because you don't have to change anything that you're already doing. So maybe you don't watch House Hunters, maybe you watch football. I don't know. I don't want to put that on you, but you have something in your daily routine where you'd really prefer your dog would just lay down on a bed or on a mat. And if you grab your clicker, then grab your dog's dinner, and in that context, mark and reinforce the dog on that station, you'll very quickly build a behavior that you can then incorporate into your lifestyle.
Very cool. I was going to ask you if you had any advice for a new dog owner. It sounds like that's perfect advice to get started, with just dispensing reinforcement, with a clicker or with a pen or what have you. So
yeah.
Great. Well, Hannah, you've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate it. I hope people check out Drinking from the Toilet. And we'll have all the links to stuff that we talked about again in the show notes. So just go to behavioralobservations.com and you can check it out there. Finally, where can people learn more about you?
You can go to my website, wonderpupstraining.com. You can also, I am active on most of the social media. I've kind of given up on Snapchat. I can't quite figure out other than the fun filters. But I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. If you just look for Hannah Branigan, it's 2 N's in Hannah, but then 1 N at a time in Branigan, and you'll find me.
Got it. And you mentioned a YouTube channel earlier.
I also have a YouTube channel. Yes.
And
yes.
What is your YouTube channel? Is it Hannah Branigan?
Same thing. It's under my name. Yep.
All right. Great. We will get that stuff. Links to all those things. Hannah, this has been great fun. I am sufficiently motivated to go hang out with Scout and to be a little bit more reinforcing to him, of course, under the right circumstances. So thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.